So way back in 2001, when I was first beginning the formation process toward deaconhood, Michelle and I had to go for an interview with Bishop Banks. This was rather nerve-wracking for Michelle and nerve-wracking for me, and possibly also for Bishop Banks. And we sat together and had a really wonderful conversation. He's a good man. And through the course of the conversation, he started to ask us about our children and raising children. And this was entirely appropriate and fair. Most guys who begin the road to becoming a deacon wait until they're empty nesters, till their kids have left home, because, to be honest, it can be it can take a toll on a family. Just in terms of the time commitment and the marriage and the time with your kids. And our children were small. The youngest was only 3 years old. So Bishop Banks was completely appropriate and well-intentioned, I think, to really ask us about raising kids and our style and approach to parenting and so forth. But as the conversation went on, he began to talk about how difficult it is to raise kids in the world today. And I began to get the sense that he didn't really believe that Michelle and I had the character and fortitude to be parents and raise these boys. So I started to feel a little uncomfortable, and I finally pushed back and said, well, in all candor, Bishop, I had transgressions in my youth. Please don't hold perfection up as the bar that these kids need to attain, because I too had transgressions. And he leaned forward and he said, well, yes, of course you had transgressions. We all had transgressions in youth, but the difference is that you knew they were transgressions. In our world today, no one knows their transgressions. Everything has been normalized. And what Bishop Banks was telling us that day is that our world was losing the ability to tell the difference between the darkness and the light. And how much more true is that today, 17 years later? Have we lost our ability to tell the difference between the darkness and the light? In a couple of weeks, we're going to enter Holy Week. And when we listen to the Passion on Palm Sunday and again on Good Friday, we're going to encounter 3 instances that are uncomfortably close to home, that suggest maybe indeed we have lost our ability to tell the difference between darkness and light. The first is ambivalence toward truth. Ambivalence toward truth. Truth, Pilate scoffs. What is truth? And with that dismissal, he renders truth irrelevant. It was an ancient and more eloquent way of saying fake news, to just simply dismiss anything that is inconvenient to us, to decide that truth is irrelevant. We don't need to worry about it. If there's anything that has really marked our public conversation in the past several years, it's how quickly we have been willing to abandon concern for truth. We expect lies. We participate in lies. We advance lies. And we all seem to be okay with it. But not just in the public dialogue either. In our own inner dialogue, are we honest with ourselves? Are we telling the truth? Are we authentic to who we are? It seems to me that most of the people I encounter either exaggerate their own goodness, sort of a self-affirmation bias, and downplay their own brokenness. Don't admit it, don't deal with it. Hold themselves up as being pretty good and not admitting their own brokenness. Or they do the opposite, and they're so preoccupied with their own goodness or their own brokenness and so consumed by it that they don't see their own giftedness, value, and talent. And how rare is it to find someone who's so authentic that they see themselves and every other person as created in the image and likeness of God, but not quite complete yet, still on the journey, still broken and needing other people to make us whole and complete. The truth of authenticity. When we give up on truth and we don't concern ourselves with it, when we become ambivalent toward truth and inauthentic to ourselves, we've lost the ability to tell the difference between light and darkness. Secondly, animosity through law. We have our law, the people shouted. We have our law, and according to our law, he must die. Crucify him. If you've been following the news at all the last few weeks, you've seen countless stories of men and women who have lived here since they were 2 and 3 years old, grew up here, went to school here, went to college here, got married, had children, have jobs, and are being deported, being torn apart from their families and being deported. Why? Because it's the law. We have our law. When we use law to advance injustice rather than justice, we are losing the ability to tell the difference between darkness and light. In the gospel this morning, Jesus cures a blind man. He cures a blind man. He opens his eyes so that he can see the light. But because he did it on the Sabbath and broke a rule, the Pharisees will have none of it. They are more interested in the letter of the law than in the spirit of the light. And when we become more interested in the letter of the law, following the rules, than in the spirit of the light, we have lost our ability to tell the difference between darkness and light. And third, abdication of responsibility. Pilate, we will hear, symbolically wash his hands, a metaphor for, it's not my problem anymore, it's on you. How often are we taking responsibility for the world around us? Our world is crumbling. The climate is on the verge of a major collapse. People are dying. Starvation in certain parts of the world is way up. Do we care? We kind of do. Maybe we recycle our soda bottles, Do we care? Because we are decimating our public policy around environment. We are ripping it apart. Do we care? Or are we only concerned about personal impact to me? Economists call it the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is what happens when we focus on our personal interest and allow the consequences of our personal interest to be spread out across a large number of people. Get as much for me as possible and let other people deal with the fallout from that. The tragedy of the commons. A few weeks ago, our public conversation was wrapped up in tax policy. And I saw and read a whole bunch of articles on what the change in tax policy means to you. But I did not see any articles on what the change in tax policy means to education in poor districts, what it means to aging people who are living on fixed incomes. I did not see what the impact of the tax law means on the environment, on neighborhoods, on communities. It was all of the articles were, what does it mean to you? Because that seems to be what's most important to us. Abdication of personal responsibility for the well-being of the world around us. I grew up in a Catholic church and a Catholic home that spoke often of the common good, of something we called social sin. No one talks about this anymore. What is my obligation to the common good? What is my responsibility to social sin? We don't talk about these anymore because if anything defines us in the last 20 years, it's the tragedy of the commons. When we choose the tragedy of the commons, we have lost the ability to tell the difference between darkness and light. God loved the world so much, he sent his only Son to show us the light. To show us the light. What does that look like? The light of love. Love of neighbor, love of enemy, love of the blind man, love of the beggar, love of the leper, love of the Samaritan woman at the well, love of everyone, no exclusions. The light of love. The light of forgiveness and mercy. Forgiveness of the men crucifying Jesus. Forgiveness of those who hurt us and harm us. Mercy toward all. The light of forgiveness and mercy. The light of hope and healing. That heart that makes us whole. When we choose the light, we choose Christ. And when we choose Christ, we choose the light. And we live in a world of love. My friends, the greatest threat to our families and our homes, our neighborhoods, our community, our world, is not that there are people out there doing dark things. The greatest threat we face is that we lose our ability to tell the difference between the darkness and the light.